Welcome back, CJ213. So we're going to be going over the prison experiences, um, gendered perspectives primarily. So this is probably one of the most important and complex areas of corrections, the prison experience. Chapter 7 really gives us a deep look into how men and women adapt to incarceration differently, how correctional institutions shape behavior, and how prison culture forms and evolves. Uh, During my experience in the maximum security prison, I witnessed these concepts play out in real time. I saw firsthand how gendered experiences differ, how inmate structures form, how correctional officers navigate the challenges of managing incarcerated populations. So as we go side by side again, I'll put in some professional insights so you can kind of connect the textbook concepts to kind of real world practice. All right, so entering prison, total institution. So a prison is what sociologists would call a total institution. That means nearly every aspect of life, from when inmates wake up to when they eat, shower, attend the programs, move from their cells to the yard, to showers, anything. It's tightly controlled by an institution. For many inmates, entering the environment is the most significant shock of their lives. Um, the first thing I always noticed, especially when inmates coming in, was the look in their eye. It's a mixture of fear, anger, uncertainty. They quickly realize that the free roll rules don't apply anymore. The the no frills policy, the concept, is especially what's important. This refers to providing only basic necessities required by law. We issued their uniforms or jumpsuits, bedding, their standard 3 hots and a cot, their basic hygiene, uh, nothing more unless they earn it. They go from commissary and they can buy it. Uh, we often had inmates complain about just the simplicity or of the food. It didn't taste the best. No, it didn't. Or obviously the lack of comfort. But the purpose of the no frills model is to maintain control, prevent luxury expectations, and keep the institution focused on safety rather than comfort. So classification is the backbone of prison operations. Before an inmate ever sees general population classification, uh, the officers and administrators, they evaluate their risk levels, their security needs, their medical conditions, their mental health concerns, their STG, their gang affiliation, and programming requirements. My experience, objective classification saves lives. For example, we once had an inmate entering the system claiming no gang affiliation, but his background check revealed that he was a high-ranking member of a very violent STG, was the Latin Kings. Without classification, catching that might have placed him in a rival-dominated housing unit, which could have led to immediate violence. So objective classification uses validated tools. Staff don't rely on gut feelings or assumptions. There is critical um, in high tension prisons where misclassifying even one person can just set off a chain reaction. So external classification versus internal. External classification determines which facility an inmate goes to. Maximum security prisons like Pontiac house individuals, long sentences, violent histories, escape attempts, significant disciplinary issues, and we had death row at one time too. So internal classification determines where the inmate will live within the prison. This includes things like their cell assignments, what cell house they're going to be placed in, protective custody needs, program eligibility. Housing decisions are crucial. Putting the wrong two inmates in a cell together could just spark an assault. We had to carefully consider where to place mentally ill inmates too, and inmates obviously with medical health issues and mentally ill. So those two classifications are pretty important, especially the ones with the medical issues because they would need to be placed maybe in a single cell. They may have a cane, which really had to vet them for that. Some of them have wheelchairs, so you really have to classify them appropriately. And then obviously we have inmates that were at risk of victimization. So the National Institute of Corrections found that there is no universal classification model that works for every institution. And I can tell you that's absolutely true. Different prisons have different populations. You know, we had a high concentration of STG affiliated inmates. Minimum security facilities might have more inmates focused on reentry. A women's prison will need trauma-informed classification approaches. The NIC emphasizes that every prison must validate its tools for its own population. In real life, this means continuing to adjust classification methods based on changes in inmate demographics, shifts in gang dynamics, or new research on recidivism and risk. So the advantage of classification, when it's done right, it produces enormous benefits. Low retention, inmates who feel less safe are likely to act violently. They're less likely to act violently, let's put it that way. So it's a safer environment. Officers can perform their jobs knowing high-risk inmates are managed properly. There's fewer unnecessary restrictions. Not every inmate needs supermax level confinement. There's better gang management. Proper placement can break up violent networks. Targeted services, mental health, substance abuse, and medical concerns are directed when they're needed. Good classification meant fewer lockdowns, fewer emergency response activations. You simply can't run a safe institution without a strong classification system. So the difficulties of adjustment. Adjustment to incarceration is rarely smooth. Many inmates go through these stages: shock, disorientation, hypervigilance, basically meaning being constantly on guard, withdrawal or depression, and adopting the prison persona. I saw inmates who were terrified on day one transform into hardened individuals within months. Why? Because they're adapting to prison. And it often requires a very defensive posture. Some inmates can become aggressive to avoid appearing weak. Others will shut down emotionally. Mental health concerns, those often emerge and worsen. Depressive episodes, anxiety, even self-harm can surface, especially in segregation during those long periods of isolation. So mental health needs in prison are just staggering right now. Look at the stats. 43% of state inmates have mental health problems. 23% of federal inmates have documented health problems. But only about a quarter receive treatment while they are incarcerated. We had a mental health cell house where it was present everywhere. Schizophrenia, bipolar, PTSD, severe depression, if there's a label for mental health, we have it. So we closely work with the mental health staff, but the demand always outweighed the available resources. And I think one thing's worth noting is that women have higher rates of diagnosed mental health issues than men, and multiracial inmates also showed elevated rates too. These realities influence classification, housing program, daily supervision. So the evolution of male inmate culture, the big house. So the big house era shaped modern corrections. These older prisons emphasized strict control, rigid hierarchy. Inmate culture was dominated by the old heads, the elder statesmen, the experienced convicts who enforced this inmate code. While Pontiac is more, it's more maybe Maybe it's a little more modern than a classic big house, as it's been renovated. That old school culture was there. Um, our buildings were really old, so when I think of the big house, I do think of Pontiac. I think of Joliet. I think of Stateville. I think of um, San Quentin. The prisons like that. The ones you probably see in the movies of the big house. That's kind of what it is. That's that classic thing. But older inmates, often men or younger ones, teaching them how to survive and just how to avoid trouble and how to do time in the big house. So the inmate social code. So let's go. Thought I went a little too far. Yeah. So Gresham Sykes. This is a typology of male inmate social roles. So these social roles are real men. They're respected. They're self-controlled. The rats. They're the informants. Squealers. You know, there's a saying, you may have heard it, but it's a big saying in prison. Snitches get stitches. So you got your guerrillas, they're the enforcers. The merchants, those are the ones who trade contraband. They're also the ones that had the store. We had a coupon system where inmates would get coupons and they would go and it's just like currency. You have the wolves, the punks, uh, the fags. Those are involved in the the race of the sexual dynamics. We'll talk about that a little later. Then you have the toughs and the hipsters. Those are the image-driven inmates. We didn't have so much of that, but in the minimum and mediums, yeah, you'll probably see that. So the inmate social code. The inmate social code dictates: don't interfere in another inmate's business. Never snitch. Do your own time. Uh, don't exploit others. Be tough. Never back down from a fight. And don't trust the hacks, which don't trust staff. Even in the 2020s, these rules remain deeply ingrained. Um, I've seen inmates refuse life-saving help because they feared being labeled a snitch. The code can be incredibly destructive, but it also structures inmate society. So prisonization, this describes how inmates absorb norms. They learn who to associate with, who to avoid, what behaviors are respected or punished, how to act in front of other officers, and how to really mask their weakness. Long-term inmates sometimes become so adapted to prison life that they struggle to imagine the outside world. Some even feared release because they lost the skills needed for free world living. Prisonization is powerful, and unfortunately it's often permanent. So the evolution of traditional male inmate culture. So scholars have uh, often tried to explain cultural forms, and these four major models is what help us understand it. The deprivation model. This says inmate culture grows from what prison life takes away: their liberty, their autonomy, their privacy, especially their privacy and security. You could see deprivation shaping behavior when inmates felt powerless. They created their own hierarchies, their own systems of respect, and their own ways of coping. The importation model, by contrast, says that inmates bring their outside values with them. This is especially true with the gang members. Many arrived already steeped in the gang norms, the loyalty, the retaliation, the hierarchy, and they just simply transferred those behaviors into the prison environment. Then you have the situational model. This reminds us that behaviors depend on context. For example, inmates behave differently on the yard than in the chow hall or in segregation. A single event like a fight or a lockdown, it shifts the entire mood of the institution. And then finally, we got the administrative control model. This argues that good or poor prison management shapes culture. I saw this throughout my career. Strong leadership, calmer cell houses, poor communication or policy inconsistencies almost always created the tension and conflict within the prison. So the prison language. I could do a whole lecture just on prison language, but I'm not going to. So prison language, or Aragot, is more. It's more than just slang. It's a communication system that builds identity and culture. So it's few common terms. Um, Beef. It's a charge or a conflict. Cellie, cellmate. Fish, a brand new inmate. And a kite is a written communication. It sounds silly, but that's exactly what it is. Um, Inmates often use this communication constantly. Understanding it and learning this language helps us detect problems a little earlier. If we overheard the phrases like, "You got a green light, that means an assault's coming," officers who didn't learn prison language were often blind to what was going on around them. So in the late 20th century, prison culture uh, it evolved dramatically with the rise of the STGs, the security threat groups. I've talked about it already numerous times, but these are the prison gangs that control violence, contraband, inmate behavior. Um, STGs, where they were the most influential force at the institution. They operated like organized crime, which is kind of what they were. They used recruitment, hierarchy, coded communication, many times extortion. Conflicts between rival gangs could just spark lockdowns for weeks, even months. Seen that. So understanding gang dynamics are essential. Officers needed to know alliances, rivalries, leadership structures, because these relationships shaped everything from when they were even in the medium security units in the day room, seating to where inmates stood in line for chow. So, changing racial patterns. Prisons became increasingly racially polarized by the 1990s. Even when institutions attempted to integrate housing, informal divisions often continued. We saw inmates frequently who kept to those who looked like them or came from similar neighborhoods. This wasn't always about racism. Sometimes it was simply about trust and survival and contraband. It's another major element of modern prison culture. Items like cell phones, drugs, hooch, homemade alcohol, weapons became currency and leverage. Some contraband was smuggled in by visitors, but the most dangerous items, especially the weapons, the cell phones, were usually either, the weapons definitely were constructed inside the facility, but one of the most dangerous item an inmate can have is a cell phone. Obviously, this wasn't constructed in the prison. They got it from somewhere. Most of the time, unfortunately, they got it from staff by means of extortion, whatever it may be. They got something on them. It's really easy to get manipulated by an inmate, and to where they'll have you do something for them because many times they got something on you. So the best thing that I've learned over the years is just say no. They respect that because they're you say no, they're going to move on to the next person. So if you do end up, a word of advice, if you do end up going into corrections, no is your single most best word that you can ever use. Just tell them no because they expect it. They expect to hear the word no. They're looking for that person that's going to say yes. So it's just say no. Okay, so sex in prison. All right. So in 2003, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which is PREA, they fundamentally reshaped correctional practice, established national standards for preventing, detecting, and responding to sexual abuse in prison. PREA required these three things: collecting national data, training all staff and inmates about prevention and reporting, and providing states with resources to reduce sexual abuse. PREA training became an annual requirement in our cycle training. It taught us how to identify vulnerable inmates, how to document allegations, and how to intervene safely when coercion or victimization was suspected. PREA changed the culture by making sexual safety a central part of correctional practice. So, sex in prison occurs usually in these three contexts: consensual sex, even though this can be complicated by power dynamics. That's one of them. Coercive sexual behavior, one inmate pressures or threatens another, and yes, sex for hire. Transactional arrangements, usually that's tied to contraband or some type of protection. Officers really had to stay alert to the subtle cues of coercion. Inmates rarely openly reported any sexual abuse because the inmate code punishes snitching severely. Instead, we look for behavior changes, withdrawal, fear around certain inmates, or just attempts to avoid specific areas. And one of the big ones is suicide. So, how common is sexual assault? Well, it really does go underreported, but national data suggests that the staff, let's see, 2008, 45% perpetrated by other inmates, 55% reported by staff. So it's a reminder that abuse can happen anywhere. It can happen anywhere power imbalances exist, and that's pretty much prison for you. We encourage reporting, but inmates they still fear retaliation. And addressing sexual assault requires stronger supervision, improved classification for the vulnerable inmates, the ones that go to protective custody, and better staff training to recognize this predatory behavior. So prison violence, it takes several forms: riots, staff assault, inmate on inmate violence, self-harm, suicide, and use of force incidents. Each type requires different prevention strategies. In max prisons, violence was an everyday possibility. Officers had to be trained, alert, and prepared for rapid response at all times. All right, so riots and other major disturbances, they often require, for this to happen, inmate unity. And they can be planned, they can be spontaneous. In addition to the physical riots, inmates sometimes engage in hunger strikes or work stoppages as any form of protest. It usually ends badly for them, though. I saw these incidents, these disturbances triggered by the big one: policy changes, racial tensions, gang retaliation, and grievances about food or medical access. Going back to the policy changes, so much has happened in the last probably 25, 30 years. The policy changes in all states and prisons. Smoking was a big one when we took away smoking in prisons. Almost all inmates smoked, so you took that away from them. Their first couple months was rough. There's so many different things that are linked to the policy changes, and that's what usually those major disturbances come from. All right, so inmate violence, staff violence, self-harm, inmate on inmate violence often happens quickly. It's unexpected. Homemade weapons, shanks, they're frequently found during searches. Even seemingly harmless materials could become very deadly. I've seen a guy make a shank out of toilet paper. put it in the toilet, they soak it, and they just keep wrapping it, let it dry, so they'll grab it, it becomes as hard as a rock. I have seen that, and it was very deadly. So they can make anything or anything. Um, Staff on inmate violence is less visible, but it still remains a very big concern. And a lot of institutions, professionalism, proper training are just essential to prevent this. And self-harm, prison suicide is it's one of the most heartbreaking forms of prison violence. Isolation, despair, mental illness. They just push inmates into just suicide behavior. Uh, our segregation unit had some of the highest suicide risks cases I've ever encountered. We had to do suicide watches. We had an entire part of our gallery that was strictly designated just for the suicide, just for the suicide watches. It was every day, every day. So, causes of violence. Violence can emerge from many sources. A history of violent behavior, untreated mental illness, the need for survival, overcrowding, uh, lack of conflict resolution skills. Many inmates grew up in environments where violence was the only tool they learned to solve problems. Part of rehabilitation involves teaching new skills, something that requires programming, consistency, and obviously adequate staffing. So let's just move on to females in prison. So while I don't know a whole lot about this, I never worked in a female prison. I knew people that came from a female prison. That actually, when the female prison that was 25 miles away closed down, those officers came to work at Pontiac, so we got to hear some of the stories. Women are a very small portion of the prison population before the 1960s, and only a few women's prisons existed. But in the 1980s, due to the war on drugs and mandatory minimums, we saw a pretty significant rise in female incarceration. Again, we often collaborated with staff before Dwight Correctional Facility closed. We collaborated with them. We collaborated with the Logan Correctional Center, which also housed female inmates. So the difference in inmate behavior, needs, culture, very significant. Female prisons tended to have less outward overt violence, but more relational conflict. So the trend's rapid increase in female incarceration is really tied to mandatory minimums, drug offenses, accomplice liability, where women were punished for their partner's actions, and these get tough policies that removed judicial discretion. The equality movement also unintentionally removed some of the paternalistic protections the justice system historically gave women. Today, sentencing is more gender neutral, which is a good principle, but it has contributed to rising female incarceration. So the characteristics of women in prison come from different backgrounds: childhood abuse, domestic violence, unstable homes, substance abuse, poverty, untreated mental illness, and they also faced a higher risk of HIV. These factors really emphasize the need for trauma-informed correctional practices. Female inmates required different programming, not because of ability, but because of the nature of their lived experiences. So traditional classification tools were often built around male inmates, but women's risks, their needs are very different. For example, women are less likely to escape or commit institutional violence, but they're more likely to have mental health or substance abuse issues. Gender specific classification, it helped identify their trauma history, their parental responsibilities, their mental health needs, their health issues, um, their risk of exploitation, and transgender inmates added another layer of complexity. We had some of these. Historically, um, prisons housed them according to their biological sex, not gender identity, but this frequently created safety risks. Today, many states reevaluate housing on a case-by-case basis now with the transgender movement. So the Ward and Kassenbaum study was 1965. So these early studies, they suggested that women adapted to prison by forming homosexual alliances, often as a means of emotional survival in a stressful and unfamiliar environment. These relationships were sometimes unstable and could conflict with the institutional rules of the facility. So later scholars found that women created fictive families. These are uh, informal kinship systems that where inmates adopt roles such as mother, sister, or daughter. Unlike men's prisons, where hierarchy and dominance often define the relationships, women tended to form these nurturing networks. These networks help them cope with uh, loss, stress, institutional pressures. Contemporary research. So studies, especially by Barbara Owen, reveal that many women today avoid drama or the mix. They prioritize staying low conflict and focusing on programming and personal development. One key difference from male prisons is that race is less central to grouping patterns among women. And unlike men, women tend not to organize around formal gangs. There obviously there is women gangs, but very very at the minimum there is. Trying not to butcher this name, but Krutenschmidt and Gartner identified three coping styles. The adoptive style, which is conforming to institutional expectations, convict style, embracing prison norms, and the isolate style, which is just withdrawing from others. Understanding these styles help explain inmate behavior and really informs classification and programming decisions. So program disparities. Historically, women's facilities lack the vocational programs available to men. Cases like Fairfield Leach versus Leach highlighted this inequity. Although progress has been made, many women's prisons still lack this robust educational and vocational opportunities, and this just limits their reentry success. So, effective programs for women, they kind of focus on empowerment, decision making skills, trauma recovery, health education, substance abuse treatment, gender affirming medical care. Women often come into prison as victims of trauma, and treatment really must reflect that reality. So, motherhood in prison. More than 60% of women in prison are mothers of minor children. Many were the primary caregivers before the incarceration. Their imprisonment disrupts families profoundly, obviously. I mean, family ties are just they're critical for reentry success. but many facilities are far from uh, the family home. Um, when a lot of them, depending on their classification, depending on what institution they're at, it limits visitation. So that has a profound impact on the family. So if you look at this chart here, so kind of focuses on the children's well-being after parental incarceration. So this all depends on the stability of the caregivers, the child's depends on access to support, the quality of parent-child relationships, um, and the age at which the parent was incarcerated. Correctional policies that support communication and reunification, it significantly improves the outcomes. Nursery programs. Some states allow incarcerated mothers to keep newborns in special nursing units, sometimes up to 3 years. But these programs can really strengthen the maternal bond, uh, reduce recidivism, and it really teaches them what parental skills that they need once they get out. But this does require special housing. It requires trained staff. It requires very careful screening. So healthcare concerns. Uh, Women in prison often experience delays in treatment, inadequate reproductive health care, uh, shackling during childbirth, lack of substance abuse treatment, and of course, poor mental health services. These these gaps remain a major focus of reform efforts. Healthcare it's a constitutional right, and prisons really have to meet that standard. So sexual abuse, women face higher rates of inmate sexual victimization than men do. Abuse by male staff also remains a very highly documented problem, as highlighted in a lot of human rights watch reports. Facilities really have to enforce strict professionalism, surveillance, and accountability to prevent abuse and ensure safety. So the paramilitary model, correctional officers really work in a paramilitary structure. At PCC, everything was organized through chain of command, strict discipline, precise routines, clearly defined roles. Um, our primary responsibilities were always the same: security, custody, control. Whether you were patrolling the yard, monitoring the control room, escorting inmates, everything revolved around maintaining a safe and orderly environment. So, conflicting goals and expectations. Uh, Correctional officers faced tension between enforcing security and supporting rehabilitation. At times, it felt like you're caught between two worlds. Administration wants the programming, inmates want leniency, and the public wants safety. Many officers feel isolated, they feel unsupported. That's why a strong support system, your trusted colleagues, good supervisors, that makes all the difference in the world. And then we have the gender conflicts. Historically, some argue that women shouldn't work in a male institution due to concerns about physical strength, manipulation, inmate privacy. Cases like Dothard versus Rawlinson challenge these assumptions. In reality, I work with many exceptional female officers who just commanded respect through their professionalism, their communication, and consistency. So gender does not determine effectiveness. Professionalism does. My wife is a prime example. We met in prison. Yes, we did. We met in prison. Um, my wife was the epitome of all that I just said. Professionalism, communication, consistency. Communication was the key. Um, She she could intimidate a 6'6", 350-pound inmate just by how she talked. So can't tell me that a woman can't work in a male institution. So regarding the prison, uh, corrections is it's a craft learned over time. Veteran officers pass down these skills uh, to the new officers coming in, and it's important to find a good mentor that's actually going to show them how to do it the right way and not the, the wrong way. You'll be able to detect manipulation, build rapport, prevent contraband, de-escalate conflicts, and you still. And I'm going to say this. I should say it in every lecture. Be firm, be fair, be consistent. Those three things will get you very far in corrections. The best officers really set clear boundaries while treating inmates with dignity. Those who followed these principles had fewer conflicts and safer careers. So working in women's prison, um, it definitely required additional training. It required training in trauma awareness, gender responsive programming, respectful communication, health and safety needs. But again, professionalism is key. Staff must treat inmates with dignity and refuse to tolerate abusive behavior. Um, from inmates to coworkers, it doesn't matter. Inmates or coworkers, it doesn't matter. You have to, you can't tolerate that. Uh, Many correctional staff continue pursuing their education and training to just keep providing and improving environments for both staff and incarcerated individuals. All right. Well, that is the end of our Chapter 7 lecture. I hope that you got a lot out of this one. This really got into the weeds, but I look forward to delivering Chapter 8 here shortly, and I'll see you in that one.